And this is Joe Armstrong and the AIX Virtual User Group webinar for August. And before we get going on today's topic, I decided I have a couple of things I wanted to start with. First of all, I just want to give out my usual pitch here for the IBM Power Systems Technical University. We had one, in Orlando earlier in the year. So there's a second one this year. They're doing two of them this year. And this one is in October. So you can see here it's October 16th to the 20th and in New Orleans. And I do have a discount code for everybody that gets on the AIX Virtual User Group. The discount code is TUXVUG, and it will give you what they call the early bird pricing. So it's $20.95, but this won't expire. So you can use this code up to the day of the actual TechU University. So and on there also on the AIXVUG wiki, there's a link to the registration, so you can take this and go and link to the registration as well. So I just wanted to get that out there. Also, as I mentioned earlier, I am recording the session, and the presentation materials are all off on the wiki as well. Let's see, we'll go back to the wiki here. And down here, you can see here's the presentation materials here on the wiki for today's topic. So speaking of today's topic, we've got Jackie Lynch joining us today. Jackie's a longtime power person. She's been 40 years in the actual IT business, working with mainframes, Unix, mid-range systems, personal workstations. Started in Unix really in 1993 and been working on power systems since '99. So Jackie's been an IBM customer for 22 years. She's worked for business partners. Right now, Jackie is an independent consultant. So she is not an IBM employee, as most of our speakers are, but Jackie's an independent consultant. If you go to any of the IBM conferences, TechU or whatever, you're sure to have seen Jackie, at least if you haven't seen her actual talk, seen her on the board, because she speaks at all of those. She's got great information. So today, Jackie is going to talk to us about VIO servers. Now, every power system just about uses virtual IO servers. Almost everybody that has one uses virtual IO servers. And to virtualize everything, they've done a great job of making our systems more usable. So there's a lot to them, though. You got to take care of them to get the best out of them. And Jackie's here today to help us with that. So Jackie, I'm going to go ahead and make you the organizer or the presenter again. Make sure let me know if I got the right one.
Nope.
No, okay. So, it just keeps bouncing around on me.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. There we go.
Try that one. Okay.
So, all right. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending the session. Joe will tell you that I'm paranoid. I actually have two computers up and connected so that if we lose power or anything, I can still stay connected to present. With that said, the presentation I'm going to talk about today is the care and feeding of VIO servers. And the intent of this presentation is to just take people through some of the things you need to do in order to take care of them. In terms of the agenda, we're going to talk a bit about best practices setup, installation, maintenance, and so on, and also about backup. One of the things that I have found is that many people don't realize you do need to back up your VIO servers and your HMCs and so on. Depending on how we're doing for time, we may cover this HMC and firmware maintenance at the end. And I have a couple of links in here on some articles that I had published. There's a complete guide to system maintenance, and there's an article on maintaining the HMC in the IBM Systems magazine that you may also find helpful. So let's start a little bit with best practices setup. If you've ever heard me speak before, I am a huge fan of staying current. One of the things I learned over the many, many years of being a customer was that if you get behind in your maintenance or your firmware, you have a problem, you open a PMR, and the first thing you get told is you need to update firmware or adapters or your VIO server or whatever because it's already been fixed. So it is really important that you do stay current. And by current, I don't mean it came out on August 23rd, so you put it in on August 24th, but certainly staying within a couple of months. And so I talk to people about having a maintenance window at least every 6 months to update VIO servers and firmware and so on. What I have here for you is just the VIO server life cycle. Right now we're at 225.20. 226 is coming in the second half. But I have also links here to the README so that you can actually go and read what 225.20 provides and so on. And then I also have a note that as to what your NIM master needs to be at if you use NIM to install your VIO servers. And as of earlier this month, there's now Service Pack 2 for your HMC, and that does have some prereqs. You can't go to 886 SP2 without being at 8860. This is just another showing you the life cycle so you can see when you install a particular VIO server level, how long that's valid for in terms of end of maintenance, marketing and end of service. So we're currently at PowerVM 225, and some of the things that came with that were support for the new E850 cloud server, also for DDR4 memory. So if you're getting a new Power 8 and it has DDR4 memory, you're going to need to be running PowerVM 225. There's a bunch of increased scaling things, some LPM improvements and so on. Also understand that when we talk about PowerVM, it's actually more than just the VIO server. PowerVM 225 is a system that includes the VIO server, specific system firmware release minimum, specific HMC release minimum, and then it also comes with an overlink. So just keep that in mind, that you can't just put PowerVM 225 on if your system firmware is not at 860. In terms of when you want to do updates, there's a number of different links that IBM now has. FLIRT stands for the Fixed Level Recommendation Tool, and if you go there, you can plug in all the levels that you're at, and it will tell you what the minimum recommended levels that you should go to are. There's also a version called FLIRT Lite, and what FLIRT Lite does is it just has a table that shows you them all. If you're not sure what level your NIM master needs to be at to be able to restore your VIO servers, this link here, the VIOS to NIM master mapping, will give you all that information. And there's a whole bunch of other ones here. So, and there's also a link here to the AIX support lifecycle. And this is just showing you from FLIRT what the minimum NIM master levels are. One thing I did want to call out for you is that Fix Central went through some changes. If you've been using Fix Central to download patches and you were always able to FTP to delivery for and then use anonymous and your email as a password, that no longer works. They have moved to secure FTP. From an AIX LPAR, that means you do an FTP -S, and when you actually get your fixes ready to download, they will provide you with a user ID and password. However, you can also use SFTP, which is what I do, where I just use SFTP, whatever that username is at delivery, put in the password, and I use mget. I prefer SFTP, and typically you will have SSH open, so you're not having to go and ask for additional ports to be opened, because SFTP will use those SSH ports. And then I've just got some links down here about some critical VIO server patches. So in general, and what I'm finding is I'm starting to get involved with a lot of accounts now that are running not just AIX, but Linux and IBMI. And virtualization, although it's been around for a while, is new to many IBMI users. So there's a lot of people are very fearful of the VIO server. They've been told it's an appliance and they don't want to touch it. Well, you still have to keep it up to date. You still have to secure it, because if you leave things like Telnet up and running, that's not a good thing. So the approach that I take is I'm a big fan of the KISS principle, the keep it simple. There's a lot of things you can do with a VIO server. You can make the design and architecture incredibly complex, and then good luck trying to solve a problem. So I try to do things as simple as I can. One thing I do make sure of is that the logical memory block size is the same on all my servers. That's really important if I want to use LPM, because if I want to use LPM, it won't work if they're not the same size. And you basically find that out in the properties for the server. You can actually go and look at the memory, and here we go. So this here is my server, and if you have a look, you'll see that the memory region size here, that's what I mean by the logical memory block size, is 256 meg. So I try to make sure whenever I set up a server that they all have the same LMB. And the reason you want to do that up front is because you have to power off the server to change it. Using hot pluggable adapters, if you use dual VIO servers, which means that for most servers you need to order a server with a split backplane, that allows you to do concurrent updates. I can update VIO2 while VIO1 is carrying the load, and then I can bring back up VIO2, have it become primary, and I can do my updates on VIO1. I also set all the adapters to desired, not required. That way, if I'm missing an adapter, I can still get my VIO server to boot. And then there's a bunch of other tips here. I'm a huge fan of the HMC scanner. That is a great way to document your system. You point it at the HMC and it documents everything on every system that HMC sees. All right. As I mentioned earlier, you want to plan on one update a year. And you also, some people like to separate their VIO servers. Some people separate them for production and non-production. I don't tend to do that. Sometimes I will separate them though for networking and IO so that I can run my networking, and we'll talk a little about that in a non-threaded mode, and that way it will actually give the network precedence and it will improve performance. You need to test failover. If you add a bunch of LPARs and you think the zoning's been done correctly, one of the things that you want to do is shut down VIO1 and see if VIO2 takes over and if the LPARs are still okay, and then do it in reverse, because you don't want to find out that you've missed a zoning problem when you have to take a VIO down for maintenance and suddenly your production LPAR goes down. So one of the things I always say is test your failover, both the SEA and the disk. Also, and I was guilty of this, if I couldn't figure out how to do something in the VIO server, I'd go into OEM setup env and I would do it as root. Anytime you're doing maintenance on the VIO server, wherever possible, you should use VIO commands as padmin. Going into root should be a very, very last resort. If you are booting your VIO server from internal disk, you need to mirror it. That way, if you lose an internal disk, your VIO will stay up and you have time to recover it. A few other things, fixing paging. By default, even today, the VIO server still comes with two different page spaces, a 512 meg HD6 and a 1.5 gig paging 00. And they're on the same LUN. And one of the things that we've learned over the years is you never have two page spaces on the same LUN, and especially not on internal disks. So I always get rid of paging 00 and make HD6 4 gig. And this was supposed to have been fixed several times, but every VIO server I've installed at every level still has this issue. I also add logging, set up dump devices. The VIOS advisor, that is the PART command. And if you run that regularly on your VIO server, it will actually give you performance information and information about how, whether you have enough memory and so on. I can't overstress the value of checking the ERRPT command. There's nothing worse than opening a PMR with IBM because you've got a, let's say, an IO performance problem. And then they look at ERRPT and they go, well, yeah, because you've got disk errors. So you should be checking that. We'll talk about entitlement as well, but you should not run your VIO servers at or above 100% entitlement. Even though you can give it a lot of VPs, the reality is that the network performance and the performance of your VIO server scales by entitlement, not by VPs. So, and you will see definitely a performance degradation if you are continuously above entitlement. And then taking backups, and we'll talk about backups. A lot of people do not back the VIO servers up. They don't think about it because they think about it as an appliance. That's very important. Okay, so how do you figure out how big your VIO server should be? Unfortunately, there's some sizing documents out there, but I've found that they don't do a phenomenal job. Some of them are good. So what I tend to do is I have my own spreadsheet that I use, and I use that to figure out roughly how big things need to be. Is it perfect? No, but I monitor it later with part to make sure I gave it enough. But the thing to know is that the more high performance adapters and the more virtual fiber clients that a VIO server has to support, the more memory it will need. So where we used to start with an entitlement of half a core and maybe a couple of gig of memory, that doesn't work anymore. We actually need to give it more memory, and I'll show you in a minute. So for 10 and 8 gig adapters, and of course that includes all the 40 and the 100 gig, all these high performance ones, you need a lot more memory for buffering, and you need more CPU to handle traffic. If you are running virtual Ethernet, the word virtual simply means that somebody else has to provide the memory and CPU. So that's going to be, for virtual Ethernet, it'll be the VIO server, and it will also be the individual client LPARs. So it's not uncommon now to see a VIO that needs 6 to 8 gig of memory and an entitlement of 1 to 2 cores or a couple of dedicated cores. So here I talk about the spreadsheet you can download. Rather than make you look at it in the small form, this is the actual spreadsheet. And so what I do here is I plug in the installed memory, the active memory, the logical memory block size, how many high performance adapters per VIO. So in this case, I have, this is actually active adapter ports, sorry. So in this case, I have 8 per VIO, so a total of 16. Each VIO server has 12 VFCs. So think about that as if I have one LPAR client that is connected to 4 fiber adapters using NPIV, that one client counts for 4 VFCs. So this might not be 12 LPARs, it could be 3 LPARs, each connected to 4 NPIV fiber adapters. And I also keep track of the IO draws. And being a capacity planner, I have a safety net. If you have active memory mirroring, which you can get in the E850C and above, then I set that to 2. That way it doubles the hypervisor size. And this divisor is simply a divisor it uses to calculate overhead. And if you're a P7 plus or P8, that's switched to 128. If you're lower than that, it's usually 64. So what it does, I put all my LPARs in here with desired and maximum memory, and it calculates my overhead. And what's important about this is it also figures out how much memory that VIO needs additional for those high performance ports and also for MPIV. Here's where it doubled the hypervisor. And so if you look at it, you'll see that I had, 194,560 meg of memory active. When I add up all my memory, I really need 185 gig. But when I also add my overhead, it turns out that I really needed 203 gig active, and that's a shortfall of almost 13 gig. So how does that happen? Well, number one, we have to take in the fact that the hypervisor is at least 768 meg times 2 if it's mirrored. Each IO drawer, because it uses memory at the top of memory for what we call translation control entries, needs some memory. IBM used to publish those numbers, they don't anymore. So I always use about 512 meg for every couple of IO drawers. Then on top of that, the way that it calculates the actual memory overhead for each LPAR is based on your maximum setting, not your desired. The reason for that is each of these LPARs is a virtual memory LPAR that has to be mapped to real memory. So in order to do that, it has to create a page table entry that takes the real memory and maps it to the virtual memory. And basically, it has to be able to handle a DLPAR operation to the maximum memory size. So it sizes that page table based on maximum memory. And it does a calculation based on that overhead, that number one, that 128 that we had before, and it rounds it up, and then it basically makes sure that it's a multiplier of the logical memory block size. So you come up with this overhead number for each LPAR and you sum it up. And if you were to look at your actual LPARs, sorry, your actual server, and you were to look at the memory, what we really, oops, hang on, I'm not going to get this to come across. What we're really looking for is under memory. What we're looking for is this, the reserved memory size. This is actually the the memory overhead, the 4.25 gig. So that's what is being used right now on this small server for things like page table entries and the firmware and so on. All right, so that's just one of the things you have to take into account. Now, in terms of the VIO server, typically the default HBA settings for your fiber adapters are not going to be sufficient. Depending on where they're installed, by default, this num command elements will be either 200 or I think I've seen it at 500. And this max transfer size will be set to a 1, not a 2. So what are those? Num command elements is the equivalent of queue depth for the adapter. So basically, if it's set to 200, that adapter can only have 200 IOs in flight at a time. And then this max transfer size is a DMA, direct memory access area, which is used for building the IOs on the adapter. So by default, they're not big enough. Now, depending on what technology level you're at, it does actually set this to 2 behind the covers, but it still looks like a 1. So I set this on every fiber adapter on the VIO. The other thing you should know is that you will also need to set it on your NPIV clients. You cannot set the client higher than the VIOs. And so you change it on the VIO first, and then you must reboot the VIO server before you change it on the clients. Otherwise, if you change it on the clients and they're larger, the client will not boot. So at AIX 71TL2, 61TL8, they put a limit on num command elements of 256 on the virtual fiber clients. So the LPARs that were clients could not be set to higher than 256. Then in July 2016, they allowed you to increase it to 2048. So the VIO server, you could still set to 2048. So a couple of things to consider are, what you need these to be set to, and you can monitor that with the fcstat command and see whether or not you're actually dropping IOs. So you want to make sure that you have those set large enough. And if you look at, so this is like a default setting on one of my LPARs. You can see the 1 here, which gives me a 16 meg DMA, and the num command elements of 200. And then I set it here to 2, which gets me 128 meg. So that's something you should make note of. Don't accidentally put an extra 0 in here, because just changing 1 to 2 went from 16 meg to 128. You put an extra 0 in here accidentally, and you're probably going to make that way too big. In terms of num command elements, if you are going to raise it much above 1024, you do need to check with your disk vendor that they will support that. Not all disk vendors support large numbers for that. So you change it with this command, and the -P says come in at a reboot, and then obviously you have to reboot. And there's a very, very good tech doc. Dan Braden is like the IBM guru of queue depth and IO and these things. So there's a very good tech doc that he wrote that I highly recommend you go and read if you want to get into tuning these beyond the basics that I'm talking about. This is just showing you my VIO server and client, how it was set initially. And now we're going to talk a little about the network. So in the network, you have a bunch of options. The one that I tend to use is link aggregation. And basically, what I tend to do is SEA failover. I'll have VIO1, we'll have a couple of ports that are aggregated together, and VIO2 will have a couple of ports aggregated together. It gives me the redundancy without having to use nib, and that way I get to use the full bandwidth of the adapter ports. So what do I mean by that? There used to be an issue with older switches where if I had 2 ports aggregated in an LPAR, they had to be connected to the same switch. Newer switches actually allow you to do those aggregates across switches. So if you have a newer switch, you can actually have VIO1, have 1 port connected to one switch, 1 to another switch, and you can do standard or LACP aggregation. And the same with VIO2. What that allows you to do is you get the full bandwidth of the 2 ports on VIO1 or VIO2, whoever's the primary, versus with a nib, one of those ports would always be inactive. So out of 4 ports, you'd only get the the bandwidth of 1. So, and nib is a little bit pingy. It pings to check that everything's up. So I definitely prefer to do SEA failover. As I said before, you do need to pay attention to entitlement. Your virtual Ethernet, which means also your SEA, scales by entitlement. So this doesn't just apply to the VIO server. If you're making extensive use of SEAs and the virtual Ethernet, you need to pay attention to the entitlement in all of the client LPARs as well. If you are continuously above entitlement, you need to correct that. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can have a VIO server, you can split your VIO servers, and you can have a pair that only handle disk I/O and a pair that only handle the network. If you do that, then you can disable network threading on the network LPAR. And the reason for doing that is that it will improve your LAN performance. By default, the VIO server will run in threaded mode, and that way it gives a better balance if you've got vSCSI and your LAN. If you don't do that, if you switch it to non-threaded, then the LAN gets precedence over everything else, and you don't want to do that in an environment where you have a mixed environment. You also want to look at putting on large send on the virtual Ethernet adapters, on your SEAs, and so on. If you are supporting Linux or IBM ILPARs, there are a couple of URLs here you need to go and read. And pretty much, if you're not at current levels, then you can't put Linux or IBM ILPARs behind an SEA that is running large receive. But these URLs here go into it in great detail about large send and large receive and when you can use them with IBM I and Linux. So I would just check those to make sure. But if you're in a purely AIX and VIO server environment, absolutely turn on large send and large receive. So what I'm showing you with this diagram, which came right out of the Red Book, is basically what an ether channeled environment looks like. So here we have 2 ports from one switch being aggregated together in a link aggregate. And then we have a virtual Ethernet here, and then we have the SEA. And then some people put the IP address here on the SEA. I don't. I put it on the virtual. And the reason for that is if I have to disassemble my SEA and rebuild it, I still have my IP address information and everything here, and it still works. This is also showing a nib connection. So here I have 2 ports on this switch, and then this is the backup port that's on a separate switch. And like I said, you don't have to do that because there are other ways that you can do that with SEA failover if you have modern switches. And even if you don't have modern switches, you could have VIO1 on one Ethernet switch, VIO2 on the other Ethernet switch, so you still have switch backup. So you have a lot of different options you can look at. So in terms of the network, your network is detuned by default. It's basically set up for a 100 meg network. There's a long history of that, of IBM wanting to be standard with Unix, etc. The reasons don't really matter. What matters is that you understand that that's the case and what to do about it. So by default, TCP send and receive and UDP send and receive are too small. They're very tiny. Every system I set up right at the beginning, I run these 5 commands. All right, and people will say to me, well, I don't need to tune UDP. I don't use it. Actually, you do. Things like DNS servers and so on make significant use of UDP. So I always set UDP send to 65536. There is no point in making it any bigger because the IP stack won't allow you to. And I set UDP receive to 655,360 because on average you receive about 10 times as much UDP traffic as you send. And then the TCP send and receive, I set to this 256 meg here, 262.144. That is what's recommended for 1 and 10 gig networks. However, if you do not set RFC 1323 to 1, this is still capped at 65536. Even though it lets you set it, it won't use more than 65536. And then there's another one called SB Max, which is the maximum socket buffer for an individual socket, and that should be at least 104.0.0.0.0, which it normally is, but it's just one more thing to check. So if you run ifconfig -a, it'll show you your SEA, and you should either see nothing here or this. What I sometimes see is that they've changed TCP send, but they haven't fixed TCP receive, and this is still set to 0. And that's because at some TL level, IBM decided to help you and to try and fix the network being detuned. And the problem is it wasn't quite done right. So unless it says this, and if it does say something different, then you need to use the chdev command to fix it. But you still should run this no command, because if you set up any other network, so you might have 3 or 4 SCAs, it's only going to set this on the first one. And the others will be using whatever the defaults are, so they won't be tuned optimally. So hopefully that makes sense. So in terms of network performance and throughput, I do have a couple of network performance presentations up there that you can go see. I also highly recommend looking for the presentations by Alexander Paul. He has some great presentations, particularly related to 10 gig E. Goes into a lot more detail than I am capable of. The key things to take away are you have to have enough CPU power. I can't say it enough. Entitlement matters when it comes to the network. Your MTU size will make a difference. The default MTU is 1500, but if you go to 9000, which is jumbo frames, or even larger sizes, provided your packet size is warranted, then you can actually save yourself some CPU because of the way that it does the coalescing and aggregation. Having said that, if you're going to use different MTU sizes, you need to make sure that it is end-to-end. So if you have a virtual Ethernet and 2 LPAs talk to each other through that, as long as they're both set to the same MTU size, you're fine. But if you're going out through the SCA, through switches to a remote site, then you need to make sure that the switches, the firewalls, everybody is using that same MTU size for that particular network traffic. A couple of other things to hit on down here: firmware on adapters and server, and also the e-fixes for 10 gig E. Periodically, and probably about every 4 or 5 months, IBM will bring out mandatory firmware for the 10 gig E and other adapters. And they do fix a lot of known performance problems. So I highly recommend that you make sure that the firmware on those adapters and any known fixes for the 10 gig E networks are applied, because they will make a difference to the performance that you see. All right, so VIO servers, as I said, we're at 225, but I just want to stress that there was a really important change that came in at 223 that people are still not really aware of. So traditionally, we'd set up our SCA with our physical adapters, a virtual adapter that we lay the SCA over, and there might be some other adapters for the aggregation. And then we would add something called a control channel, which we typically put on something like VLAN 255, and that way the SCA would send its control commands over that. Well, as of 223, you don't have to specify the control channel anymore. If you, instead of doing the make VDEV like this with the control channel, if you leave that off, it will default to VLAN 4095 for your control channel. If you're not sure if you did that, there's a command that you can issue. I think I've got it. I think I have it on a later slide, but basically you can find out what it's using for the control channel. So I set up all my VIOs now using 4095 for my control channel. A little comment here about messing up priorities and control channels. You need to make sure that VIO 1 is set to priority 1 for the SCA, VIO 2 is set to priority 2, or vice versa, but do not set both of them to priority 1 or both of them to priority 2, and don't mess up the control channel, because if you do, you will cause a spanning tree loop, and if your network people haven't protected that at the firewall, you'll take your network down. So be very careful with that. And the nice thing about this 4095 VLAN is that multiple SCAs can use that same VLAN within the same virtual switch. So it does save you some VLAN IDs as well. It does require that your HMC is higher than 7.8, but if you're running a Power 8, you have to be on version 8 anyway. And it requires certain firmware, etc. levels. So now let's talk about installing VIO servers. You have multiple options for how you install them. You can install it from DVD, which is a complete install. you could, if you've already got NIM servers created, or if you do the correct things, you can actually use NIM to install it. You can use the HMC. So when you go to the HMC nowadays and you go to add a petition, you can actually tell it that you're adding a VIO server petition, and it will actually give you the option to, when you go to boot it, of install. It'll actually give you the option to install the iOS. So what happens is when you first install the HMC, it actually uploads the VIO server code, if you're enabled for Power VM, into a repository. And that repository will have probably 2250 at this point in it. And so you actually have the ability to have it install from there. You can actually check the repository, and unfortunately I don't have it on mine, but you can actually check it by going into HMC management, click on this Manage Virtual IO Server Repository, and it will give you the name of the image. I actually have to import a new one on the system, but what's nice is they hold about 18 gig for it, so there's certainly enough space. And then you can basically boot from that. You can also use the install iOS command if you like doing command line stuff. One thing that you have to take into account if you're doing this using the HMC, you have to have a live network between the VIO LPAR and the HMC, and it cannot be aggregated. If it's set to aggregation, which is typically how we run the network to a VIO, the boot fails. I've had absolutely no luck with that one. So you want to do it before they turn on the aggregation. And then the fourth option is from a makes this be. So if you've backed up another one, you can do that. As I said, you can use NIM to back up, install, and update your VIO server. There's some things that you need to do. You do not use an LPP source for this. Basically, you take the VIO server backup image and you create a spot from that backup, from that makes this be image. And then you can use after that, you can use the NIM-O update iOS, etc., etc. And you can also use alternate disk install if you want to use alternate disk install, and you can also create alternate root VGs. So the way you do that is you add your VIO server partition as a NIM client, and then you have to actually build the makes this be image. So on the VIO server media, there are now 3 images. 2 of them are on DVD1, 1 of them is on DVD2. So first you copy them to a directory, then you use the cat command to combine them into one makes this be image. And you define that makes this be resource to the NIM master. You then build a spot by pointing to that makes this be image and tell it to build a spot. You don't ever create that spot from the LPP source because there's a whole bunch of stuff in the LPP source that does not get installed into a VIO. The other thing that I do is I copy the BOSINST data from the DVD for the NIM software and create a VIO server BOSINST resource. And now you can do a BOSINST install once you define the partition. So that's for creating a clean one using NIM. Obviously, you could do that from the DVD. It just takes a lot longer. Once you've got it set up with NIM, it's really quick. So the other thing that people run into if they don't have a NIM server is they'll install VIO1 from their DVD or however they install it, but VIO2 doesn't have access to the CD. So how do I install VIO2 from the CD? Well, if you have a split back plane and half the disks are in VIO2, then what you can do is get VIO1 installed, bring it up, and also put the VIO2 disks into VIO1. So you added the adapter. Now you can actually clone. So in my case, HDisk0, HDisk1 were on the adapter that VIO1 was going to have permanently, and the other 2 disks were on the other adapter for VIO2. I put all the disks into VIO1. Once I had my NIM completely configured except for the network, I basically used Alt Disk Copy to clone it to HDisk2. I then exported and RMDev'd all the disks, shut down VIO1, took the resources away, and reactivated VIO1. And then I was literally able to just boot VIO2. Now, once you do that, you have to do some cleanup, obviously removing definitions for adapters and networks or anything like that that wasn't used. But this is a very quick way if you have to do the install from DVD to actually get VIO2 up. And then some of the cleanup stuff you have to do, you got to stop RSCT, you have to clean up the node IDs and generate a new one and so on. So there is cleanup work you have to do, but this is a very quick way to get VIO2 up and running if you don't have the ability to do it across the network or anything else. In fact, I'm actually going to be doing that later today on a VIO server. Okay, so that's the quick install stuff. There's a lot of other things that I do when I install it. I set up logging because by default it doesn't log. I set up Nmon to run 724, all those kind of things. I do look at Nmon data for my VIO servers, and there's a number of things like that that you should just be setting up. So now we talk about maintenance and upgrades. So updating a VIO server, a lot of people are a little nervous about doing this because it's working and they don't want to touch it. But you really do need to do it. So there are steps that you need to go through. The first thing is, before you do upgrades, you need to make sure that you do them in a particular order. What I have found typically, and I do read the READMEs now, I upgrade my HMC first, then I do my firmware, then my VIO servers, and then AIX. If my HMC and firmware are up to date, then I just start with the VIO servers. I do go and read the READMEs because there have been things in the READMEs before that have saved people. And the example I give people was one of the earlier firmware levels actually had a warning in there that you had to be at a certain HMC version before you did the firmware. And if you did not do it in the right order and you did an LPM move, you messed up your service processes. And a lot of people did that. So again, you want to read the READMEs and particularly look for where it says that, this is critical. Make sure that you do it. Okay, so you download the updates. I always cross-check compatibility with FLIRT. FLIRT may not necessarily show you the most recent level because what they do is it's the minimum level that's recommended by engineering. I run error report to make sure there's no problems, and then I do a bunch of checks to make sure, like I'll do an LSVG, root VG, and make sure there's no stale partitions or stale physical volumes. I'm going to make sure there's no missing disks, missing paths, and so on. And the reason for that is, why would you want to update a VIO server that's broken? Fix what's broken first. Ensuring all paths on the clients are redundant. One of the things you could do is just reboot the VIO server before you do anything to make sure there's not an issue. You could also go through, run fcstat, you can run lspath, you can make sure that you have the correct number of paths and so on. And then I always run HMC scanner. I run HMC scanner or sysplan before I make any changes and after I make changes so that I know what got changed. And then you take a backup. Then depending on how you plan to do the update, whether you mount an NFS file system or the DVD or however you plan to do it, you need to mount that. If you are using shared storage pools, there are some very specific steps that you have to take that are outlined in the README. You need to go and read those and follow those. So in terms of migrations, I'm sincerely hoping that you're at least at 223 at this point. If you're not, there's steps that you have to follow. In order to get to 223, there are a number of steps that you would have to follow, and it's usually multiple upgrades. And if you're prior to 1.3, you're reinstalling. And quite honestly, the further back you are, sometimes it's better to just reinstall and get a very clean install. But that's something you'll have to decide. Using NIM, you can create a single merged LPP source to get around some of these issues, but it just depends on what you're using for multipath drivers and so on. And there's stuff on the migrations and the managing and monitoring book. And IBM also, if you're really back level, offers a simplified migration offering. Once you get to 2.1, that's when you get the update iOS command, and that's when you can start using NIM. So also, one of the other things to check in the README is some of the mini packs require a minimum level. So example, 225.20 requires that you get to 2.2.5 first. You can't just go, I'm on 223, I think I'll go to 225.20. So this is an example of just putting a fix pack on, going from 2232 to 2233. And I will update this before PTECU to be a more recent version. The first thing you have to do is log on as padmin. I've done all my checks, but run iOS level, see what level you're at. You can get the same information using catting these two files. And then you have to commit all previous updates. So you run the update iOS-commit. I also become root and make sure there's no efix data on the system, because typically if there's efix data, depending on the efix, you may have to uninstall it before you do the update. And I have a lot of efixes on my LPARs. So I like to keep them completely up to date. So as an example, right now on my 22520, I have 4 efixes on that solve security issues. All right, then we're gonna, I run the iOS level. I also make sure none of my file systems are full. And as I said, I become root and I run OS level -S. So the reason I do this is my iOS level might show 2232, but if my OS level shows 6100-00-00-0000, then I know I'm missing file sets. And I want to fix that before I do the update. Because if you don't fix missing file sets or broken file sets before you do the update, and you continually do updates, there will come a point in time where you can't do an update anymore. And I actually ran into that. So I like to keep this very clean. I'll run inspix and make sure that all the file sets are found. I'll run LPP check, and I'll run ERRPT. I do this before and after. All right. Then I have a script that I run that saves a bunch of files. You don't need to do this, but I do it because I'm paranoid. I also use the Vios BR command to run a backup. And what that does is it backs up all the virtual settings. So when you restore from a makesysbe or using NIM, it's only going to restore the basics of the VIO server. All your virtual connections and everything get restored from the Vios BR backup. So I back it up in padmin, and then I will run my makesysbe. And you can do it by basically running the backup iOS command in padmin, or if you're like me and you like to write scripts, you can't really run a script from padmin, so I run it from OEM setup env, but it basically says, run this as padmin, and here's the command. So it's taking a makesysbe and backing it up. And for me, user local backups happens to be an NFS file system. And it's on my NIM server, so if I have to then restore it, I can take the backup and I can make it a resource in NIM and use it. We used to have to run a separate save VG struct for any other volume groups in the VIO server. Now it does it automatically for you when it does the backup iOS. And so that's what it's doing here. It's saving my other volume group. And then down here, it's running my makesysbe. You get the ISO image. I grab the ISO images and then I loop mount them on my NFS server. I use SMTY-BFF create to create the directory. So now I have a directory that I have all the files that are in the updates in. I always copy that to a local directory on the VIO server. The reason I do that is if I lose the network during the install, that's really not a pretty thing if I'm using NFS. So I copy them locally. And then basically, I run update iOS and point it to the local directory. And then it will come up and it will basically say, I have a boss.rte.install to install. Can I do that? You go, yes. And then it will come up and it will say, okay, now I have another, it could be any number, but this one was 272 fixes to put on. It shows me the estimated space and the free space. I can reply yes, and it will begin installing. Depending on how many patches, it could take 30 minutes to 2 hours. When you're done, you run iOS level, and again, check the OS level -S. I always find out what my root VG disks are, and I run a boss boot against them in a boot list. Even though it says it did it, I've had too many times where a boot list has been screwed up, so I just run it anyway. After the reboot, go through the same checks: iOS level, LPP check, ERRPT, etc., etc. Once VIO Server 2 is back up and appears to be functional, I go do the upgrade to VIO 1. You do not want to have two VIO servers that are at different levels for a period of time. That's not a recommended practice. Okay, so that's what happens in a perfect world. What happens if stuff's broken? So in this case here, we have the VIO server comes back and says, well, I'm at 610000. So what we do is we go, okay, I'm going to run instafix and find out, where I'm missing file sets. Well, it turns out I'm missing file sets at 610008. So you can run this OS level -SQ. What that does is it tells you the service packs that it knows about. And the one I'm interested in is always the highest level one, which is this 8.2. What I can then do is say, tell me any file set that is a lower level than 61.8.2. So here it identifies the two ones that it nearly always is. For the boss alt disk install boot images, and for some reason I get the Spanish file set all the time. So you have a choice, and you could do this with Update iOS. You can basically remove them or you can update them. Those are the two choices that you have. So if you were going to remove them, the other one I get hit with sometimes is Suma. If I was going to remove Suma, I would just update iOS-remove boss.suma. If I wanted to update it, so let's say I wanted to keep the alternate disk install, what I would do is I would copy the boss alt disk install boot images into its own directory. I happen to have one called user local soft missing because over time I've figured out which things I'm typically missing. And you have to run update iOS-commit, and then you run update iOS and you point it at missing and it will update them. So just be aware that you may have to do that. And typically it's boss.suma, alternate disk install, and as I said, for some reason, the Spanish file sets. So let's talk a little about e-fixes and i-fixes. There are a lot of security patches out there, and just as you would put them on your AIX LPAR, you need to put them on your VIO servers. So I use FlirtVC, which is a vulnerability checker. You download it to your computer, to your LPAR, and then you just run FlirtVC, and it gives you a lovely list of all of the patches, all of the known security holes that you have and what the e-fixes are. It gives you a link to go and find them. You go and find them and you download them. And things like Java, OpenSSH, OpenSSL, you're going to need to update those. And there's other security holes. So if I run emanager-l, it's going to show me the list that I have on. If I have nothing on, I'm going to want to run FlirtVC and find out what I should have on. And then basically you run, once you get them downloaded, you can run this emanager-p-e and whatever the name of the package is. And then if it's successful, then you remove the -p and it will actually install them. So this is something that you should be doing on all your systems just as part of clean living. And they fix a lot of things very quickly. So now we'll talk, so now we've got it installed, we're going to talk really quickly about backup and recovery. I mentioned this viosbr command, and basically you use that to back up all the virtual and logical resources. You can also use it to restore them or to view them. So once you have that backup, you can go and view what it's actually backed up and so on. And I put the link in here to the home page on it. You might also need to use Snap to grab other critical data, depending on if you have a problem and you need to report it to IBM. And in my case, I do all my backups over NFS to my NIM server. So I will run backup iOS and point to that particular directory. And depending on how I do it, if I use the -makesSB flag, it creates a makesSB image. If I use it without the makesSB flag, it will create a NIM resources tar package that you can use for cloning. So I do both kinds of backup because I never know for sure which one I'm going to need. Also, If you are using file-backed optical, which a lot of us do, which allows you to load ISO images on your VIO server and then make them available to our client LPARs, then you want to, if you don't do it the way a lot of people do, so for instance, for me, I tend to put them in a different volume group, and that way I don't worry about backing it up when I do a makes SB. But if you have them in your root volume group, then what you want to do is add the -no media lib flag. Otherwise, you end up with a very large makes SB. And as an example, my current repository, which is in root VG, is like 90 gig. I don't really want, when I do a makes SB, to back up that 90 gig as well. I can rebuild those ISO images, or I can back them up separately. So I basically run it with the -no media lib flag. As I said, I run a script from root, which just backs up a whole bunch of extra files. Then I do my VIO SBR, and then I run my makes SB. And then I'll also sometimes do my NIM one as well. You can also set up a daily backup with VIO SBR. And what this will do here is for 7 days, at whatever time you tell it to run, it will do a backup of those logical and virtual resources, and it will keep the last 7 copies. And it will put them in this directory. So that's something also worth thinking about. This is a little script that I run. You don't really need to do this, but I like to run a whole bunch of iOS CLI commands, lsmap -all MPIV, etc. And I save that, and then I copy it off to another system. I like to have the ability to rebuild things very easily. So I tend to set all my systems up to be self-documenting. Now, in terms of monitoring, I've already stressed a million times that the VIO scales by entitlement. And as I said, you'll also want to pay attention to the client LPARs as well for virtual Ethernet. What you want to look for is virtual context switches. If you see a lot of virtual context switches, this can be a sign of you being short of entitlement. And if you're running close to entitlement, you really want to increase it. If you're running close to VPs, you probably need to increase entitlement and VPs. More and more, I'm seeing people on busy systems moving their VIO servers to dedicated cores. And that works very well. And then the last comment, about you've got to clean up those VIO server page spaces, but you never, ever, ever want to let your VIO server page. If your VIO server is paging, then every LPAR that it is servicing is impacted. So it's literally better to take 4 gig of memory from a production LPAR and give it to the VIO server than to let that VIO server page. I use Nmon to monitor, and I basically run a 24-hour Nmon that runs all the time with this command down here. And then if I need to grab something a little more granular, I'll run this version here. Down here is a list of what each of the statistics are. I took the capital W off here because I don't run Workload Manager on my VIO server. If I have a client LPAR, I use the same version of Nmon, but if I'm running Workload Manager, I'll add the -W. So also the VIOS Performance Advisor, that's that PART command, P-A-R-T, that will also provide you with really good statistics. Now, in terms of shared processor pool monitoring, and also this also impacts your ability to get cross-hypervisor statistics. For every LPAR, you need to be able to turn on the allow performance information collection. So if I pick my VIO server here and I click on properties, you'll see this allow performance information collection down here. You need to turn that on. If you don't turn that on, then things like LPAR stat -H aren't going to work properly, and you're not going to be able to get what we call cross-LPAR statistics and so on, including things like the available pool processors in the pool. So things like Topaz -C won't run and so on. There's a number of different ways to monitor the shared processor pool. And by the way, I turn this on for every LPAR, and it's dynamic. So there's a number of different ways to look at the same thing. So this is shared processor utilization out of Nmon Analyzer. This is my LPAR, that's everybody else, and that's what's left in the pool. So just be aware, and then as I said, there's on the slide, a couple of slides previous, there's a number of different ways to get the same information. In terms of getting NPIV statistics, it used to be a real pain because what you would have to do is go to every client LPAR and get the statistics there and then combine them. Well, as of version 223 of the VIO server, the performance advisor, the part command, actually provides NPIV aggregation information. As of 222, you can actually run FCStat on the VIO server, and as long as you give it the correct WWPN device name and fiber adapter, it will give you the statistics for the virtual adapter. And then there's the NPIV graph that will help with visualization. And there's a bunch of new options on FCStat, and particularly the FCStat-D command that provide a lot of additional statistics on adapter usage. And the FCStat-D will actually provide you with some high watermarks and so on, which will help you correctly size things like num command alums. So another thing I want to talk about in monitoring is buffering. If you run a netstat-v on your VIO, and actually you can see this on your clients for your virtual Ethernets. So I go down to my SEA or my virtual Ethernet, and everything looks good, but then I start seeing these packets dropped and these no resource errors. And as I scroll down and I get to the virtual Ethernet, I see hypervisor receive failures. Now these may not exactly match, but if you're seeing them in all three places, that means you don't have enough memory to vent the virtual buffers. So we typically have our TCP send and receive, but when we're using virtual Ethernets, which the SEA depends on, we also have a bunch of virtual buffers, and we have to make sure that they're big enough. So if I keep scrolling down, I'll see these virtual trunk statistics and a bunch of numbers. And what I'm looking at is, what is my maximum buffers set to, and what was the maximum that I actually used? So here for my small, you can see that my maximum was set to 2048 and I used 2048. That means I ran out of buffers. So then I have a choice, and I can change these. Now, in this case, I would bump my maximum to 4096, and I would probably bump my minimum to 2048 because I don't want it spending a lot of time freeing up and allocating buffers. Some people will set the minimum to the maximum. My only issue with that is that you then don't know if you have a problem. So what I would tend to do is if I was setting that to 4096, maybe I'd set the minimum to 3172 or something. So it is growing and shrinking, but it's not growing and shrinking from 512 to 4096. Like I said, when you set them to the same, yes, you give up, you get back some latency because you're not growing and shrinking, but you also don't know if you have a problem. So this is something that you almost always have to tune on a virtual system with a heavy network. This is not a dynamic change. When you change this, it is a reboot of the LPAR, and you may not have, it may not just be the VIO servers you have to change this on, you may have to change it on all your clients as well. So just be aware of that. So I don't know, Joe, do we have time to talk a little bit about the HMC stuff, or is this a good place for me to finish?
Well, we can certainly talk about it. We have about 25 minutes left, Jackie.
Oh, okay, cool.
And we have some questions to go through at the end as well, but I think you can take some time for this.
Okay. So I wanted to bring HMC maintenance into this because it's very important with the VIO servers, and there's a few gotchas, and I've fallen into most of them. I told somebody once that the way I learn things is I make mistakes, but at least I make them in my test lab. So this is just an example of upgrading from 777 to 778. Nowadays, if you are Power 5 or below, you're going to be on 779, hopefully. If you're Power 6 and above, I hope you're on version 8, and if you're Power 8, you have to be on version 8. But typically the way I do, and I don't care if it's like version 7 or version 8, I SSH to the HMC with 2 sessions, and when I'm doing an upgrade, I always save my upgrade data. I make sure I have enough memory. You can run this mon HMC. It will tell you how much memory you have, how much is used, and so on. You really want one with more than 4 gig of memory nowadays. You can also check if your file systems are full by using this monhmc -r disk. Let me see if I can run that on mine. So what it will show you is each of the file systems, and you can figure out how full they are and so on. If they're looking full, then you're probably going to need to free up some space. And the way you do that is with this HMCFS -OF -D0. That basically clears out any temp space. Once you've done that, you can then look to doing your actual upgrade. So the way you can do the upgrade is you do a get upgrade files, and IBM has 3 repositories for HMC stuff. They have one for upgrades like to version 778 or version 883 or whatever. So it's a version release change. Then they have ones that are based on service packs and ones that are based on individual fixes, and you need to know which one you're going to. So in this case, we're doing a change. So we'd do the get upgrade files and we'd go to this V7780. On my second SSH session, I'm going to set up a loop that basically runs an ls-la on this file system. And I will see the files downloading. It's very frustrating because once they're downloaded, all of a sudden you see nothing in the directory. And that's how you can tell that it finished. And then you can exit that connection and you change the HMC to basically do an alternate disk boot. And then you do a shutdown that reboots, and it takes anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, depending on your network connection, for it to do the upgrade. Now, you can ahead of time download these files, which is what I did here. I can FTP them down to a NFS mount, and I can actually then point this, instead of at the IBM side, I can point it at my own FTP server locally and maybe have a better connection. So you have a couple of choices as to how you do it. Once the HMC comes back up, then you have to add any updates. So as I said, there's 2 different directories. There's the software server HMC fixes, which is just for fixes, but if it's a service pack, you're going to have to go to updates. So what I typically do ahead of time is I'll use a web browser to go here and see which directory the stuff I need falls in. And then you put them on. One of the things that's a little frustrating about doing HMC updates is, let's say you have the actual upgrade, and then you have a service pack, and then you have a couple of mandatory fixes. So that's 4 things. Each time you have to go through the whole reboot process. You can't put them on and group them. It's one at a time. So when you're planning the time for your HMC update, you should allocate at least 20 to 30 minutes per patch plus actual install time, because it's going to take 20 to 30 minutes to reboot. So I've had HMC updates that take 4 hours, and it's just because I have to put one level on, reboot, put the next level on, reboot. So that's what this process is then. Before you do this, you should take an update. With the more modern releases, they've removed the ability to back up your HMC to the DVD. So you're going to have to back it up to a USB stick, and for some reason it likes 8 gig USB sticks. You can also back up to an FTP server. I like the 8 gig USB sticks because they can be cycled off site. So you back it up before, and then you back it up when you're done. Now with HMC version 8, which is required for Power 8, there's minimum levels of the HMC that you have to have, and it will also validate entitlement for your Power 8s. It introduces a bunch of new things, and it will not support anything prior to Power 6. And another note I have here at 887, which is coming out in this half, classic mode will go away, so start using the enhanced mode, but I also believe that the levels that I think it stops supporting Power 6 as well, but we'll wait till the announcement to see if that's the case. So just be aware that there's a transition with 887, and I'm one of the people that has to stop using classic mode because I'm bad for doing what I know. So if you want to upgrade to HMC version 8, you have to be at least 778 with a particular fix pack, or 779. and then you can do the upgrade. If you try to do it prior to that, it is a reinstall, not an upgrade. There's particular versions of Power VM that you need for the new performance metrics and so on. I fell into this one a couple of weeks back, not reading their README, we won't talk about that. But if you want to go to 886, you have to get your HMC to 884 plus this mandatory fix, or 885 plus this mandatory fix for the upgrade to work. Otherwise, what it will do is it will do a reinstall. So be aware of that. And I did document this in the article I wrote on HMC maintenance. Here I have a bunch of useful HMC command line commands, things that I found to be very helpful. This one down here is particularly helpful if you're trying to figure out whether or not your server is has its entitlement correct. And by that I'm talking about there's a universal access key they use with Power 8, and when that expires, you can no longer install firmware. It's tied to your hardware maintenance agreement. So I run this command periodically to make sure that I know when my UAKs expire. But there's a number of commands here. And if you find any others that are useful, please don't hesitate to let me know. I got documentation on the HMC scanner here because I just think it's a phenomenal tool. It's one of the best documentation tools that you can have. It does a great job. You basically, it SSHs to the HMC. You can use it with a flex to the FSM, and it goes through and it documents all the little bits and pieces, including the SCA and so on. I run it from, I typically run it from AIX because I've just found that from Windows, if you don't have the right Java, you can have some issues. And you literally just point it to the HMC, point it to the HMC, HSC root, the password, and I always put -stats. It goes through, it scans every server, documents it, and puts it in an Excel spreadsheet. You download the Excel spreadsheet, and you're good to go. Right, and then the last thing I want to talk about really quickly is firmware maintenance. So this article just came out. It's about entitlement on power systems, but basically with Power 8, IBM now checks entitlement. So when you go to apply a firmware fix, it's going to check that you have a valid entitlement. And for anyone that's ever been in entitlement hell, you want to resolve this ahead of time. So you can basically check that update access key, and if it's expiring, then go and get a new one. The way that those work is when you originally get your server, it will come with a UAK that is valid for whatever the default warranty is. So for an E850 and below, that default warranty is 3 years. So if you buy an E850 today, 3 years from now, your UAK will expire. For an E870 or E880, it's 1 year. Once it expires, you have to request renewals, and they only give them to you 180 days at a time. So if you buy a hardware maintenance agreement when your HWMA expires, and let's say you buy a 3-year one, you don't get a new UAK for 3 years. You get one for 180 days. So just be aware of that. It is well documented on the site, but it was very confusing, which is what led to me ending up writing that article. In terms of maintaining your environment, IBM does keep a firmware code matrix. I typically go to Fix Central, plug in the box, the current firmware level, and find out what the latest firmware level is. Depending on how long it's been out, I may or may not update to it, but I do try to stay very current with firmware. And my strategies are typically, I try to stay within about 3 or 4 months. I look for hypers and things like that. And also if I have a problem on a server, let's say I'm having a particular performance problem or a particular behavior, I will go and read the firmware history file for that server to make sure that the problem is not fixed in the level of firmware that I'm not running. At a minimum, you should try to update your firmware and your adapter firmware at least once a year. Getting behind on that's not a good thing. It will actually at some point stop you being able to update your VIO servers and so on. Obviously, in order to do firmware, you have to have access from your computer room. There's a number of ports that you probably have to open in your firewall. Those are documented on the IBM websites, but just be aware that that's the case. And then I have the next few slides are just a number of useful commands that you might find helpful when you're trying to look at things, including, like, I can never remember the text format for these, so I have them documented for the setting up mappings, my vSCSI commands if I'm doing vSCSI, MPIV, you know, the LSDev virtuals and so on. So hopefully you'll find that those are useful. There are various sites online where they actually have all these documented, and people use them all the time. I also have the useful HMC commands. Like, you can actually find out what BIOS level you're running. You can find out networking information. You can check your LMB size this way, and you could check your entitlement. So there are a number of, if you want to just log in to issue the commands, you can do it very quickly. And then these are the ones for the updates, and I documented here the different locations for upgrades, fixes, and service packs. So I'm showing you the output of some of these. I don't think we need to go through all of these. Yeah, and then I have a number of references here to different places. Nigel and Gareth in particular post a lot of things. And in case you weren't aware, we have the US virtual user group. There's also a UK one. And like Joe's group, they actually do publish replays of all their sessions. So I highly recommend that you go to both of these sites and download the historic stuff, because there's some really, really good material there. And
the UK group does have some really good stuff, and the only problem is that to hear it live is like 4 in the morning here in the US. So the replays are out there though, and I know Nigel just did one recently on the HMC.
That's why I mentioned it.
Yeah.
I can't get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to watch it, so I've never watched it live, but I have downloaded every session they've ever done and listened to them. And I still have to download Nigel's, but the material is very good, just as it is with sessions that you host, Joe. So I highly recommend people go and download them all.
Good stuff.
Thank you.
All right. So we do have a bunch of questions. Jackie, maybe it's easiest if you open up the question panel yourself. If you go to that control panel, you can undock it. The little icon, the left icon that's on the right side of that tab will undock it, and maybe you can look through there. While you're undocking it,
I've got it.
Got it? Okay. So while you're taking a peek at that, let me just say I was kind of surprised through the session that nobody asked about the AIX version in the VIO server, which of course is AIX 6.1, right?
Yeah, I asked Jay Krumke about that several times, and he said that there's really nothing in the VIO server yet that needs AIX 7, but at the point that they remove AIX 6, because AIX 8 or 9 or whatever it is comes out, that's the point at which they would replace it with 7.
Yeah. So it
I've
sounds
not heard
to me like
about that yet.
Yeah. So it's what I was told. So I was checking with David Sheffield, and he does all the AIX 7 stuff, and they are working on it. It's planned for next year, later next year, when they'll move to AIX 7.2, is what the plan is. So like you say, yeah, AIX 6.1 is going out of support, so we'll move off of that. But that's looks like it'll be later next year when we'll actually move to it.
Right. So I'm looking at the questions, and the first one I see is, I think it's, would I use a best practice rule of T-1 for upgrades regarding the VIO? Probably not. What I tend to do is I look at when it came out and I look at what it fixes. And I'm not going to upgrade a VIO when it's been out for a week. I prefer that somebody else debug it for me. But if it's got something that I need, then I will start to put it in my test systems and then migrate it up through my production systems. So I may not stay T-1. It just depends on the system and what the problems are that I need to get fixed, or if there's functionality it adds that I need. Like I might be on the latest, for instance, when the Power 9s come out, you're going to need to be at a different level of VIO. So And then the next comment is VIO server updates were freely available before, but now you have to have a contract. Why are AIX patches free and VIO server patches are not? Actually, AIX patches are not either. If you go to download AIX patches through Fix Central, just like with the VIO server, it's going to ask you for the serial number of the box, and then it's going to go and check the entitlement and see if you have a valid software maintenance agreement. And if you don't, it won't allow you to download them. So technically, when you download patches, you're supposed to put in the model and serial number for the box you plan to install them on so they can check entitlement. So be aware of that. The next question is, when will 22530 be available? I don't know, Joe, have you heard anything? As far as I'm aware, they're just going to go to 226, and I don't know what's going to be in 226.
Yeah, and I haven't heard about when they're available until they announce it. We really don't hear anything, so I guess we just don't know on that, or what will be in it. I'm not aware.
Right. Yeah, I haven't seen anything yet. I think what we'll probably find out is that at PTechU, because it's very close to when they'll finally give us some dates for Power 9, I think we're going to see a lot of announcements there on some of this stuff. But right now it's up in the air. I have a question on the VIO advisor, a couple of questions. The tool will give you a recommended value if you don't have enough memory, but how do you know that you have too much memory so that you can cut back and not waste resources? And the comment was made that part's not a good name, it's very hard to Google it. Yeah. So as Joe mentioned, I don't work for IBM, so I have no say in the naming of anything. If I did, a lot of things would have different names. In terms of how you figure out how to reduce the memory, the only thing I can suggest is that you use that spreadsheet that I uploaded, and basically use that to figure out if you have too much memory. I wouldn't, if the spreadsheet says you need 6 gig and you have 12 gig, I would not cut back to 6. I might go more like 8 and see what happens. But you certainly could use that.
So speaking of the spreadsheet, Jackie, I'm happy to post that on the wiki along with the presentation materials. The presentation materials are already up there, so you have all the links. Is one of those links to a place, or do you want me to post that on the wiki?
So one of the links in the presentation is to the spreadsheet. It's actually right on the spreadsheet page.
Okay.
So you're welcome to post it, or just post the link, or it's in the presentation.
Okay, so everybody can download the presentation from the wiki and get the link and go grab the spreadsheet from there.
Yeah, someone's asking about the seminar slides. As Joe said, they've been uploaded. Yeah, someone says, as part of best practices, it's recommended on AIX to keep paging space of the same size. Why is it not maintained on VIO server? Well, I've been asking that question for several years, and they keep telling me it's been fixed, and it hasn't. So I have the same concern, and I just have a note to myself that every time I install a VIO server, I fix it. So the next question's on the 140 meg per that you need per VFC. That is per port. Well, it's not per port, sorry, it is so if I have one LPAR and it's connected to 4 fiber adapter ports, that is 4 VFCs. And so I have another question about other changes I make to the VIO good with IBMI, and do they differ if it's a P880? I make these changes across all systems, whether they're running IBMI, Linux, AIX, all of the above, and whatever platform they're on. In terms of an S822, an E880, or whatever. The only thing that I would do a little differently, perhaps with IBMI or Linux, is the stuff that I was talking about with the network. I would go and read those extra URLs that talk about using large send and large receive based on the level of IBMI and Linux that you're on. In terms of the HBA adapters capable of using this tuning, so the num command alums, we're really talking about the 8 gig adapters and for the fiber adapters, or the 16 gig. The 4 gig adapters typically, well, number one, they're not even supported in some of the Power 8s now, but secondly, they're typically only used to tape. Most people who are on a Power 8 nowadays are going with the high performance adapters. But again, you can still do num command alums and max transfer size on the 4 gig adapters, but you would only do it if you noticed that you were running out of num command alums and so on. Someone else is asking me about using the rules-o deploy command instead of manually adjusting settings. Yeah, you can do that if you want. Once you get a set of rules that you like, consistently deploying them is a good idea. Just be aware that the rules may be a little different for some of the old paths depending on the workload. Now, that's interesting. Somebody just posted that they think some of the default settings changed in 22520 for the fiber adapters. I haven't seen that. The 22520 that I have did not go to these new defaults. So yeah, somebody asked about SRIOV, and Joe had actually talked to me prior to the session about adding some SRIOV stuff. I did look at doing that, and the problem is, in order to explain SRIOV and VNIC, we would have had to add so many slides that what I suggested is there's a gentleman named Alexander Paul who has a phenomenal presentation on SRIOV. So that's something that I'm sure it will be at PTechU, but I know Joe's going to reach out to him.
Yeah, I'll look at getting Alexander to do a VUG session here sometime in the next few months. And you know, we covered SROV once before, but we've made some improvements and enhancements in that. So we'll get that as one of the topics in the future.
Yeah. There's some other questions about non-threaded versus threaded mode. If you don't use vSCSI but you use MPIV, does that mean you should leave threaded mode on? I've never been able to get a proper answer on that. So I leave threaded mode on in a mixed environment where I have I/O and network on the same system. If they're separated, then I obviously turn it off on their network. Yes, you can have multiple SEAs on a VIO using control channel 4095, the new default. And someone asked me about using dedicated cores versus dedicated donating. I'm not a big fan of dedicated donating. I like my stuff to be either dedicated or shared, not bouncing between them. That's just a personal preference. There's probably no good technical reason for it. So you can try it if it works for you. That's great. Does the NIM VIOS install allow an aggregated network? I haven't tried doing it that way, so I really can't answer that. To try. I typically do my NIM install, my VIOS installs before the aggregation. Somebody has a comment that IBM doesn't support you cloning the VIOS the way I did. I don't know, I got the documentation from the IBM developer work site, so I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah. No.
And in terms of VIOS, somebody asked about putting it on mirrored disk in the split backplane versus the SAN. So I like my VIO servers, if I've got two of them on a split backplane mirrored. The reason I like that is because if my SAN disappears, I can still get my VIO servers up and I can still like check on some things. I do have a situation where I don't have a split backplane, so one VIO server is on internal and one is on the SAN. And obviously when you get to 4 VIO servers, if you do split them, then you end up having some on the SAN. I think it's a personal preference thing, but I do like having, if I've got two of them, both of them on a split backplane. It's just a lot easier to deal with. And I think Joe already answered the question about VIO server coming out of AIX7. That's going to be next year.
Yeah, so Jackie, we're kind of hit the end of our time here. So I think we're going to have to wrap up.
Okay.
I want to thank you for presenting this. I know I get a lot of, in the survey that comes out at the end, a lot of people put in, you know, more stuff about VIO servers. more just kind of basic stuff and the kind of things that you talk to that everybody really needs to know in order to make their systems run better. So this has been really, really great. Sure appreciate you doing it and putting all this stuff up. And I know you do lots of stuff for the TechUs and everything as well, but just doing it in this form is nice for a lot of people that can't get there. So really appreciate it. Thank you, Jackie.
Oh, no problem.
Thanks everybody for, yep, good. Thanks everybody for joining today. Look forward to next month. I'll get some invites out in the next few weeks, and we'll see you again at the end of September. I think we're talking with Mr. Enmon, Nigel Griffith, at the next session. So be sure to tune in for that, and I hope you have a great next month. Thank you.
Thank you.